Hi, everyone, and welcome to Innovating for Good, which is a monthly series brought to you by UNHCR Innovation and SocialGood. I'm Corinne Gray. I'm an Innovation Engagement Officer at UNHCR Innovation. So our team just got back from the Humanitarian Innovation Conference in Oxford about 2 weekends ago, and we're seeing that more and more humanitarian innovation as a sector is definitely maturing. And we're at a stage now where I think we have to ask ourselves some of the tough but important questions. Like, are we innovating and launching programs because they're cool or because everyone's doing it, or is it because it's actually meeting the needs of the people that we serve? And so part of this series is about having that open dialogue about how innovation can impact humanitarian work. Last month, we looked at bottom-up innovation and how we can empower local communities to innovate for themselves by building up their creative capacity. And today, we're actually going to be talking about open innovation challenge programs that are run by or run for humanitarian organizations online. It's a model that's definitely existed in the private sector for years, and more recently we're seeing humanitarian organizations are adopting the Open Innovation Challenge model to crowdsource solutions online to some of our planet's toughest challenges. So with us today are what I call the Dream Team panel. We have Jenny Turner, who's a challenge coordinator at Engineers Without Borders Australia. Vincent Graff, who's an ICT Innovation Officer at ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross. Olivia O'Sullivan, who's an Innovation Analyst at DFID. Nora Mackey, Academic Partnerships Lead at UNICEF Innovation Unit. And Matt Chapman, who's the VP and Head of Rest of the World Innovation Services at MindJet. And for those of you who don't know, MindJet is a company that produces crowdsourcing software for innovation. Before we get into the conversation, though, I just wanted to tell all of our viewers that we are going to be live tweeting the conversation from at UNHCR Innovation and at +SocialGood. And we're also taking questions for our panelists from Twitter, and you can do that using either the Q&A tool or on Twitter using the hashtag INNOV4GOOD, INNOV for the number 4 and good. So to my panelists, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you, bunches, for joining us. I'm very excited because I think for having this conversation, these are exactly the people that I would want to have that conversation with. And I think that the reason that you make up the perfect panel for this topic is that you definitely represent innovation challenge programs at different stages and different models. So for example, Nora, I know that you're working on challenges for UNICEF. Vincent, ICRC has launched a challenge platform very recently, so I'd love to hear more about that. And Jenny, you're taking this from an interesting approach, which is Engineers Without Borders actually runs their challenges, but for your partner NGOs. And Olivia, you're joining us from a donor agency. And I know that DFID has the Amplify program, which is definitely a great example of a donor agency funding open innovation challenges. Matt, you're a little bit different to the group, but also good to have you here because I know you work with major private sector companies like Intel, Siemens, Citi, and you help them set up and run effective innovation programs. So I thought before we got into it, I'd just like to ask each of you to very quickly describe your Open Innovation Challenge programs, how long you've been running them, and maybe one project that you've been able to successfully implement. So I'll start with Nora.
Myself off mute. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So quick intro. So I lead academic partnerships for UNICEF Innovation. And innovation at UNICEF is finding ways to do things differently that accelerate results and reduce inequities for children everywhere. So for us, challenges are an interesting model to explore and see how that can feed into that objective. And I'll just highlight a couple different models that we've tried. We ran a challenge called the First 72 Hours Challenge, a couple following an emergency, which is a critical window of time for humanitarian response, and looking at how we can improve logistics and resources and connectivity for people during that critical window to make sure that necessary supplies and services were being delivered. And that was run in partnership with Social Lab, based in Latin America, which was fantastic. And another set of smaller challenges that we've run have been with universities. And these challenges have all been based around very specific use cases coming out of our country offices. So for us, these challenges have really been about engaging local talent in the countries where UNICEF works and building a community of practice around UNICEF problem areas. And we're running another global challenge right now called the Wearables for Good Challenge, and I think there's probably a way to share that link out with the group later, which is looking at how wearables and sense children. It's an area that has had a lot of momentum in places like Silicon Valley, and we're looking at now how we can drive research and development and thinking around what the possible applications are in humanitarian spaces. And just, I don't want to take up too much time, but what the other part of the question was projects that have come out of the challenges. I'll highlight just a couple. We have one in Indonesia that came out of a challenge last year with a university there called We Are Siblings, that is working with children and their families to reduce social barriers in educational settings and social settings. And so they're piloting right now in Bogor in Indonesia with about 50 students in a local elementary school, which is very exciting. There's a post on our blog about it that I can also share out after this. And we also have a team in Lebanon who's developed a low-cost infant incubator. It costs about 1/10 of what an incubator usually costs, and it's for use in low infrastructure environments, so specifically looking at refugee camps in Lebanon, because it doesn't require a lot of external maintenance or power sources. And they are now working with local manufacturers on how to start producing and testing this locally.
Thanks, Nora. So Vincent, I want to turn it over to you if you can very briefly share your challenge program. I know it's more recent than UNICEF Innovation, but if you could just quickly describe how it works, how long you've been running them, and if you've implemented any projects so far.
Sure. Thank you, Corinne. So yeah, the innovation at ICRC started beginning of 2014, and at that time we didn't have a let's say open innovation stream to our innovation program. That only started, as you said, recently this year. So it went through actually two main tools to support the idea of open innovation. One is our platform, which is called redinnovation.org. The idea there is really to start the crowdsourcing, but starting before definition of challenges, really, which is about gathering some needs from the fields, whether internal needs or needs that could come from other partners or other people actually on the fields. So we have a maybe 2-month period where we just open it up and people come in and just share their stories. Then we use these needs to define the challenges. This is taken offline by a panel of experts here in ICRC. We use some of representative of all our units, and the idea is to take needs and try to put them together, cluster them into more common challenges, right? So the idea is not to take the need directly, but take the needs together and come up to a challenge. That's where we're now. So now we have the challenges posted. It's going to last until end of August, I suppose, where we gather some solutions and ideas. And from there, we'll go on to the next phase, which will be vote on the best ideas for each of the challenges and go to the prototyping phase before even taking again offline, taking the best prototypes and going to pilot phase. The second stream that we're doing now as well, which is open innovation, is what we call the Makeathon. So this is based on the idea of a hackathon or jam, when you take open innovation, people together and really brainstorm or work on the common topic. We call it a Makeathon because it's really about doing things which can physically touch. This is happening in India. So we are or organizing it now. It's going to happen in the October-November timeframe. And the idea there is really to take open innovation, co-development of the people in India to come to answer challenges with innovative ideas and actually bring it even to the marketplace still in India. So having something really local there, the needs, challenges, and the hackathon to get to new products. In terms of what we've, the challenges that went to real products, obviously we haven't had really any based on pure open innovation on the platform or the hackathon or the makeathon in this case. But we had one of our pilot which is about developing a new body bag. So mortuary bag here, where that was actually an open innovation organized in CERN in Geneva, where CERN is hosting a few smart brains, and they are asking for challenging from different organizations, and we came up with one challenge that they took over. They thought about it. They came up with really a few iterations of prototypings, and we're now in a phase where it's going to be tested soon on the field, this new body bag. And for information, the body bag is about really slowing down the decomposition of dead corpses. So it was really interesting. It wasn't us doing the open innovation, but we should see there that open innovation worked actually in this context.
Excellent, thank you. So Jenny, I wanted to move on to you. If you can briefly explain EWB's approach to running open innovation challenges.
Hi, thanks for having me on the panel. So I work with Engineers Without Borders Australia, and back in 2007 we formed a new program called the EWB Challenge. So effectively what it is a design program aimed to both support our community partner organisations' work in the field and also to introduce concepts of humanitarian engineering to university students. So the program is now delivered in partnership with Engineers Without Borders UK and Engineers Without Borders New Zealand, and is actually I guess embedded into curriculum in about 52 universities, predominantly in Australia and New Zealand, the UK and Ireland. So effectively what we do each year is we choose one of our partner organisations and we run a series of workshops with them to determine what projects they're either working on now or what projects that they want to work on in the future, but don't have a lot of time to do a lot of the background research to come up with new and innovative ideas themselves. And so what we do is we package up those projects and then take them to the universities, so 52 universities around the world, where we actually get students to work on those design projects as part of their university curriculum. So effectively we're crowdsourcing ideas from about 10,000 students around the world. We then take those ideas and give them back to the partner organisation and work with them to see if they can choose and distill those ideas down to see what they want to implement. Often there needs to be a little bit more refining after they get the ideas from the students prior to implementation, and we might talk about some of the challenges associated with that in a little bit. To give you an example of a program and challenge design idea that's been successful in the past was with one of our partner organisations, Live and Learn in Cambodia. Live and Learn works with communities on the Tonle Sap Lake, and the communities there effectively live in floating houses or floating villages. There's large sanitation issues in the area where most human waste actually ends up in the lake, which then becomes a source of drinking water. It's also a source of food, and it's the area where everyone's living as well. So the students kind of took this challenge and looked at it and actually came up with a floating biodigester concept. So effectively the biodigester takes the human waste and digests it and produces methane gas as a byproduct. And that methane gas is then actually be able to be used for cooking in households. So this also happened to tackle another challenge, which was the deforestation in the area and the reliance on firewood for cooking. So this idea was then given back to Live and Learn, and they piloted that. There was then lots of iterations and further sort of improvements on that design. But now it's actually at a stage where Live and Learn, in partnership with Engineers Without Borders, is looking to actually take that to scale and working with some local Cambodian entrepreneurs to see if they can spread that technology and disseminate it across the Tonless app. So that's kind of our program in a nutshell.
Thanks, Jenny. And Olivia, do you want to quickly run us through the Amplify program and how that works?
Thanks, Corinne. Yeah, that would be great. And thanks for having me on the panel. It's been really interesting hearing about everybody else's open innovation programs as well. And I guess the thing to say about Amplify is that DFID originated this program sort of towards the end of 2013. It launched really around February 2014, so it's still quite young. And I think what we wanted to do as a donor is we were very aware that there was lots of open innovation starting to happen in development and humanitarian, in the development and humanitarian sector. And as a donor, I think you want to be a good facilitator. You want to try and sort of support that kind of thing happening, because our position was that as a concept, this idea of bringing in new actors, bringing in new voices, facilitating ways for people to try out new things is broadly a good thing. So what we want to do is support that happening in lots of different areas and learn from that happening in lots of different areas so that we can build on that. So Amplify is a program with our partners IDEO.org, who are a human-centered design nonprofit. It's a series of 10 open innovation challenges which DFID is supporting. So the topics for those challenges we didn't decide in advance. We said what we will do is consult with partners at different points, and what we want to have with Amplify is the ability to put together an open innovation mechanism very quickly and work with a different partner or a different bit of DFID or a different NGO or whoever it might be to kickstart a conversation that brings in lots of fresh ideas and fresh voices on something. Because it's our position that we're often too closed, we often work with the same people, we're often too rigid. And what we'll do is for each of those challenges end up having gone through different kind of refinement rounds, both online and emphasizing lots of outreach work so we can get different voices from people who maybe don't have consistent access to the internet involved. We'll support 4 or 5 project ideas coming out of that challenge with a small amount of kind of startup DFID funding. So Amplify is very much about kickstarting a new conversation around a topic with a partner. And actually something that we initially thought about Amplify is that we were somewhat wary of tackling a really humanitarian-focused topic because we weren't sure if this was quite the right mechanism for that. And we're now on the 3rd challenge, which ended up being about new ways to develop effective refugee education. And we ended up doing that with UNICEF and UNHCR. And something which I personally found really interesting is I was quite wary of that very serious, grave topic, using this kind of newer process to get ideas in. But when we did some initial research work with a UNHCR country office in Gambella in Ethiopia, we went out to the country team who were working there, and they were really, really keen that we did. They were really interested in hearing from, getting kind of different kinds of expertise in, different ways to facilitate getting different refugee voices into this challenge, and finding ways for them to access the sort of potential and the expertise that we know is out there, but that we as a donor struggle to help make those connections. So that's something we want to support with the Amplify program. And just to briefly highlight a couple of things that we've been able to do so far. If you go to openideo.com, which is the site where we run those challenges, which was an existing site which already had sort of about 50,000 participants on it. So we're really keen to use something that already existed and not duplicate too much by creating our own. You can see the shortlist for Challenge 3, and I'm really pleased that there's a couple of ideas on the shortlist there. We haven't made the final funding decisions, but there's a couple of ideas on there that are from entirely refugee originated and led organisations. From our earlier challenges, from Challenge 1, we have some really nice examples of projects that we're just starting to be able to get in there and support. One of them works in Nairobi in Kenya to provide a kind of very low cost but high quality childcare offering, which provides income for local women who run those childcare centres, and also provides consistent support for kind of working mothers and working parents in that part of Nairobi. And what we've been able to do is, through Amplify, we give funding but also a lot of technical assistance to kind of newer organisations or actors that DFID doesn't usually work with. We've been able to really help that organisation refine their offering and refine their kind of social enterprise model. to be able to kind of roll it out. It's still very early days, but roll it out to many more children than they previously did. And yeah, further details can be found on openidea.org where we those challenges.
Thanks, Olivia. So, Matt, I know we've been throwing around the term open innovation, and just for people watching who may not be familiar with the term, can you explain what we mean when we say open innovation?
Sure, happily. I'll go with the dictionary definition, and I'll kind of give it my own sort of interpretation. So, excuse me whilst I read this to you. But open innovation is the use of purpose, inflows and outflows of knowledge to accelerate internal innovation and expand the markets for external use of innovation. But this assumes that the organisations can and should use external sort of pathways as well as internal ones. Excuse me, as they look to take their services or technologies or products forwards. So that's kind of the dictionary definition from Henry Chesbrough. But I think the interesting thing, we've been talking about innovation challenges here today, and that's one of the mechanisms that we can use to get ideas externally. But I think the really great thing here is I want to kind of signpost this out is that challenges ask great questions. You know, how can we do something better? We've heard wonderful examples about incubators, which is an example of reverse innovation. You know, we have a solution that works in this part of the world, but in this part it doesn't work. So how do we reverse innovate it to make it fit that market, if I can use a more sort of commercial word for it? And listening to the examples from both Amplify and Red Innovation, I think the other critical thing is it's not just about ideas, but it's about innovation. So it's taking these things forward and actually doing something with it. And for me, I think that's one of the most powerful things being on this panel today, is listening to not about engagement, not about ideas, but really about that flow through and how we bring internal and external resources together to basically, I was writing down some words as I was listening, to do more with less, to do things better and faster, and to get greater diversity of insight. And I think that's what I was hearing from the panel today. So that's my little spin on it.
Thanks, Matt. Now, I know you work mainly with private companies, but what do you think are some of the benefits of an open innovation program for humanitarian organizations?
Sure, absolutely. I think the benefits are very similar to humanitarian as they are to commercial. But I think the interesting takeaway for me is humanitarian organizations treasure it more. So every opportunity they get, they really maximize that. I think companies can be perhaps not as embracing as perhaps they should be sometimes when they do get that opportunity. But I'll leave that perhaps for a later debate. But I think the key benefits for me really are we get ideas from the edge. And I think in the humanitarian world, it's about the people who are on the front lines, or actually the people who we're working with, or actually servicing to a point of view, getting their inputs and their thoughts. And I think that's really important. It's not just about 5 people in a room in an organization thinking, I think this would be the best way to do it. It's really, you know, getting those people right at the front. I think also it's about bringing experts together, because sometimes the people who have the great ideas or have a combination of great ideas aren't sitting next to each other. They're not in the same camp, they're not in the same organization, but actually they're somewhere in the world. And I'd love to hear the example, you know, I heard earlier about the waste disposal. I wouldn't be surprised if people talking about that idea aren't actually in the same country. They're somewhere else. And platforms like this are really bringing these people together. And I think that's great, because what that helps to drive is collaboration. And we know from research, we know from all the publications, the best ideas are collaborated on. We rarely get the lone genius today who just says, here's my idea, and it solves it. Actually, somebody else always improves it. And I think that's another key element. And I think finally, it's really leveraging the ability to design, test, scale, and also get feedback. Innovation rarely gets it right the first time, but you're always going to improve and you're going to iterate. And I think that's the thing I love about open innovation, is that it really has that openness to its approach, and it really makes the most of what's available. And I think for humanitarian organizations is you are looking to try and do things quicker, leaner, but also find people to volunteer and help in stages and maximize the sort of bang for your bucks that you guys have got. And I think that's the difference between you and commercial. Commercial companies can throw a bit more resource, a bit more money. You have got a limited amount of funds, so you want to make the most and the best of it. And I think open innovation gives you a great ability to really maximize that potential.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that dictionary version.
Thank you.
It was actually absolutely helpful. So Matt, I think you've outlined the benefits really, really well, and that is, I mean, for a humanitarian organization, we're at a point now where the crises are extreme. We have less funding, and we have more people to serve, and so open innovation is something that can be actually very beneficial to our sector because for the first time, we're actually reaching out to people around the world and asking for their ideas and saying maybe there are things that we haven't considered. But I just want to open this up to the panel. Do you see any disadvantages or any risks for a humanitarian organization to adopt an open innovation model? So inviting ideas from the general public or who many of us might consider non-experts to submit ideas.
Well, I'm happy to take this one to start. Well, Matt just said it very clearly. I mean, the benefits of going open innovation, especially in terms of collaboration, external ideas, is probably clear and yeah, to any of us. If I focus a bit more on some of the risks that we've seen, there are a couple of things we've noticed. One of them is humanitarian is potentially an area where people might feel they're not legit to give ideas. So we've seen that kind of things where they come up and they sort of say, you know, you had this challenge, but who am I to tell you how to save lives? So that's one of the issues we had. Now, second one is about testing and experimenting. So some people will say you have an ethic around your pilots and your tests. So testing things is probably okay, but experimenting it might be very, very risky because of the nature of our actions. So ethics is really something we have to take into account, I think. And the last one, if I may, in RCRC, we have a long tradition of working some kind of confidentiality, if you want, not secrecy really, but you know, not making much fuss about some of the things. And this as well is maybe difficult for people to understand. Like, if I'm collaborating with you, if I'm giving you my ideas, what's going to happen afterward? I may suddenly think you've stolen my ideas, while it might just be about not being too much, you know, open about the results and how we tried it out.
Thank you, Vincent. I thought that was an excellent point, and you touched on something that we've also thought about, and I know in this sector a lot of people are talking about the ethics behind humanitarian innovation, and you know, terms like risks and experimenting doesn't go so well with saving lives, and you know, when it comes to risk and failure, I think our sector is extremely risk averse because at the end of the day, failure is not really impacting the bottom line, it's impacting people's lives. So Jenny, I wanted to ask you, coming from a model where you're actually selecting an NGO partner to launch a challenge for, do you think that open innovation is a model that can work in every context, or do you find in your experience that there are particular environments or particular organizations that might be a little bit more ripe for open innovation? I think in Matt's dictionary definition, there was a point where he talked about if an organization can or should. So can you speak a little bit about the can and the should?
Sure. I truly believe that any organization can embrace an open innovation process if they're actually willing to see new ideas and willing to experiment. I think the key here, though, is actually selecting the right challenges to look for innovation in. And that's what I think it comes down to. I think you actually need to first pick a challenge that isn't time dependent. So I think you touched on before that the lead time for this can actually be quite long. So for example, in our own program, it can sometimes take a year and a half before the ideas are given back to a partner organization. And then there's still a process of actually refining those ideas before they might be ready to be implemented. So I think that's probably number one when selecting a challenge for innovation is having it not being time dependent. The second one I would say would be having it be broad enough that it doesn't require too much specific information. So for an example, or to explain this better, the people that might be actually innovating and might be coming up with the new ideas might not actually be on the ground. They might not actually be able to visit the community or speak with community members. And so then it's really important that the challenge that they're actually given is broad enough that it doesn't require that specificity and those nuances of the context to actually get it right. But having said that, you don't want to go too far the other way either. You don't want to have it too broad, and you don't want to provide them with insufficient information to actually get an understanding of the context, because that's also really important, that the people coming up with the ideas and developing, I guess, new programs, new solutions, actually have a deep enough understanding of the context and of the challenge itself and of the community that is actually going to be benefiting from the challenge, that the idea or the solution is appropriate for that particular context. So I think there's really a balance there between it being, the challenge being broad enough to not require very, very specific details, but also providing enough information around the challenge itself. The next thing I think is probably really important is to actually be able to package up enough information and share it with the people that are doing the innovating, that are coming up with the new ideas, and that it actually appeals to their interests, and also that the challenges match their skill sets. So, for example, the challenges we often look at, have a technical, often engineering or design focus to them, and we actually then predominantly run that with engineering faculties in universities, but sometimes other, design faculties such as architecture as well. And I think having the information and the way it's presented to be, I guess, be appropriate to that particular audience and to have the challenges match their skill sets is fairly important as well. Because I think, open innovation platforms, on one side generate impact for community, but on another are a great education tool for people around the world, and a great opportunity for others to learn about humanitarian challenges and get involved as well. I think that the third one is actually comes down to the organisation itself that will be receiving the ideas, and coming down to their, I guess, capacity, both in a technical capacity, but also in terms of resources in people and money, to actually be able to take ideas and implement them, to actually be able to work with community groups and support them through the implementation process. And that's everything from selecting the idea in the first place, selecting which one they want to take through to implementation, and then actually further refining, piloting in the field, going back, seeking more information and new ideas to complement that, further piloting and running a sustainable program as well. So I think the actual capacity of the organisation is really key in this as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jenny. Olivia, what do you think about some of the stuff that Jenny touched on? And I know, coming from a donor-funded model, I mean, do you find that there are just certain environments or organizations that are more suited for this model, or do you think it's possible that any organization can do it, provided they, follow some specific criteria and they especially have the capacity to implement?
Yeah, I think Jenny outlined some really insightful points about what the kind of challenges that you come upon running an open innovation challenge. I agree that it's such a broad concept and category that there's probably a way that you could ensure, kind of in any situation or any organisation, you could run something along the lines of an open innovation challenge. Because what are we talking about really? We're saying we want to get outside voices in to solve this problem, and we are prepared. We are basically putting ourselves in a position where we're prepared to be surprised by the possibility that unexpected voices have the solution or part of the solution. We want to facilitate that collaboration. So I think in that very broad sense, any environment is right for it. But doing Amplify, just even in these early first couple of years of the program, we've come to understand that there's definitely some challenges that are better suited than others. And I totally agree with what Jenny said, that you need to very carefully define your challenge. And you need to think about what different voices can bring to the table. In particular, being very clear about what that challenge is, and you always have this battle between, in development and humanitarian, this is always an issue, very, very specific local contexts that you must have a really good empathetic understanding of in order to think about how you might tackle a problem, but keeping it broad enough that anyone could potentially contribute an idea. So when we looked at the Refugee Education Challenge, we did extensive research beforehand, and this is where our partners IDEO.org are really valuable partners, because they focus a lot on human-centered design, and they always, their philosophy is that before launching any challenge, you must speak to kind of end users, or however we would term that, people who are affected by the problem itself, and develop a kind of very deep and clear understanding of what is it actually like to face this problem. Not just end users, actually, also people who work on the front line of this, and find ways to get them involved in the challenge itself, but also find ways to establish some clear areas to sort of give your wider community a brief that they can respond to when you define your challenge. And with the Amplify program, we've for each challenge we've done that research on the ground in particular focus areas. And then we've also had the beginning phase of the challenge online has been a research phase. So we don't start by saying send us in your solutions. We start by saying what do people know about this problem around the world, and how can we all gain a kind of similar perspective on it? How can we know what's out there already, which is a surprisingly difficult thing to do in development and humanitarian. It'd be really hard to know what projects other people are working on and ensure that you're not duplicating what other people are doing. So we always run that phase because already out there and what do people already know. And so I think putting that work in at the beginning to really, and everyone here has a kind of different approach to that, but has identified that insight, that you must put work in, invest at the beginning to define the challenge and to find entry points for people who maybe don't normally work in the humanitarian sector. So I think that's a really critical thing. Invest in that research and invest in understanding the challenge in a new way from the perspective of people facing it.
Thanks, Olivia. So Nora, I want to turn it over to you now, and I want to look at, when it comes to actually implementing a challenge program. So, okay, you buy the platform, you have the software, and now you're ready to actually set up a challenge. So from a UNICEF innovation perspective, what are some of the challenges that you've run into in running your open innovation program, and what are some of the lessons that you've learned in terms of setting these up?
Sure. So I think, there are always many lessons learned when you bring a new tool into a large organization and are trying to figure out how to use it effectively. So the question about the platform is a great one to start off with. So we actually have used 3 different online platforms for our different challenges. Everything that we do as UNICEF Innovation is fully open source, and we haven't been able to find any fully open source challenge platforms. It seems like everybody you talk to these days and their mother has their own challenge platform. And when we have organizations of this scale who are all working around common objectives, to not have a common platform that people can use that's open source and can be adapted to different needs is a big frustration. So, we've built a few different platforms, all of some issues with them. So, that for us is one piece, is finding a platform that can actually serve the needs that we need. And, a second piece is what has sort of already been highlighted, which is sort of a bigger problem with challenges in general, I think, is that the nature of an online platform leaves out the unconnected. And there may be ways to mitigate against that, which some other people have touched on. Olivia touched on, Amplify sends teams to the field, but that's a very resource-intensive way to mitigate. If we're promoting a human-centered design approach, and we risk having a process that claims to be a user-centered design challenge that actually leaves out the users. So for us, that's been another big sort of like management and process issue, is how do we engage those voices in this process. And there's always difficulty in committing a bunch of resources and building a support system when the outcome is unknown. and that touches on the implementation issues that other people have addressed. Organizations like UNICEF plan very far in advance. All of our organizations have, a lot of bureaucracy behind them, so it can be difficult sometimes to have solutions or ideas that come out of these challenges. Ends up feeling like you're retrofitting something to existing programs, and I think that's a situation that we never want to be in, where you have, a solution looking for a problem, and that's been something that we've seen come out a lot, and it's caused us to actually completely restructure the way that we run these programs. So we actually don't run any really like solution-driven programs at a global level anymore. So programs like the Wearables Challenge are really about building a community of thought and a community of practice around a future area. So like wearables and sensors is really new for the humanitarian community. So a challenge allows us to engage thought leaders across academia, industry, young people in the countries where we're working, and really start building like a community of thought around what the opportunities are in this area, more so than very specific solutions. And when it comes to very specific solutions, I don't, maybe people disagree with me here, I'll be a little bit confrontational, but I don't really think that open innovation models on a global level are particularly effective. So solution-driven models, we now, country offices, they're run sort of at the country level, at the local level. And that means that they're engaging local young people who are familiar with the context and can go out and do research. And there's much more engagement from the programmatic staff in the country offices who are working in those areas, which strengthens the ability for those outputs to actually become programming. So, I think the last piece that I want to highlight is the importance of open source. So all winning projects from our challenges need to be open source. And I think, again, as organizations of this scale, working in so many countries, it's critical that we be investing our time and our resources in things that are in public goods that can be used and adapted by other people. So that would sort of be the last piece, how important it is to have solutions come out of this that can be shared in an open way. That is open innovation, is things that can be adapted and adjusted and built on, and that's really the way that you get to an effective solution.
Thanks, Nora. You touched on a lot of really interesting points there. We have also been having the same challenge in that, yes, we're using platforms that require internet connectivity, and we are not able to reach people that don't have access to internet connectivity. I don't know if UNICEF Innovation has the same desire, but for us, we actually want to see more refugee participation on the platform. Luckily, right now, we've just made our platform public. Before, it was only internal. And the current challenge that we have now, we've actually seen 40% refugee participation, which for us is huge. And I love what you said about open source and the importance of open source. And we actually have a question from Twitter, which I think is relevant. And this user has named Garden Pool wants to know, how can an NGO with very limited funds adopt an open innovation challenge model? And Nora, I think maybe the open source is the idea, because yes, these platforms are extremely expensive. We have to look at capacity to implement. But I'd like to open that question to the panel for how an NGO who might really want to do this right, but really doesn't have the funds, how can they adopt open innovation? Matt, I will pick on you.
Can you hear me? Excellent. Sorry, it kept going backwards and forwards on the unmute. So yeah, pick on the vendor first. Good question. I think that there are a lot of vendors out there. I think I'm going to put the disclaimer out there. So you can do your research, and there's some great people here who've already talked about some of the platforms that they're using, and Red Innovation and IDEO are definitely worth looking into, as well as our own. I do know most organisations discount heavily, obviously, for working in the NGO space, so they really do try to accommodate. I think the interesting thing, and we're starting to see it today, is really a sharing culture with platforms and vendors and organisations. Really trying to move more to this ecosystem. So you've heard about the IDEO approach. That's bringing a crowd. There are other organisations who do similarly. And I do know some organisations out there have the ability to provide access to share. So I think that's definitely one thing to consider. And if you are approaching vendors, and you'll get some good recommendations from the people here, do approach it from you are an NGO. There is also the ability, and we heard it, from one of the panelists about build your own open source. I have to say, I'm not surprised that there isn't something out there yet. I saw some early things many years ago, but they weren't quite fit for purpose, and I have seen people try to adapt different tools. There isn't one yet that's really cleanly come out yet, so I do understand that frustration. I think the other thing is to also think about the funding model, and that's another key thing when you're trying to do this. And I think there's a missing element to how all this is done yet, which is really crowdfunding. We see it in the space, for people doing investments in new innovations. But I think it's something new that really needs to come to the humanitarian space. And so whether it be getting a platform up, whether it be taking ideas forwards. So I kind of put that back out to the panel here, to myself and other vendors who might be on this call. I think that's something that we need to think about. Because if we're going to engage better and stronger in support, yes, we'll do as much as we can, but I think there's more other people can do to help to also bring this forward. So that's kind of my get-out-of-jail card answer.
Thanks, Matt. Does anyone want to respond to that before I move on? Okay. So, sorry, Jenny?
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that. I think that Matt touched on a few really important points there, and I think one of the most important ones there was having things open source. So whether that be open source platforms, so that NGOs with limited funds can actually join and participate in these larger crowdsourcing for idea platforms that are out there that are run by several organisations here on this panel. Or whether it just be the ideas that come out from other challenges becoming open source so that other NGOs can access them. But in addition to that, I would say that you don't necessarily need an online platform to have sort of innovation and to be able to do this within your organization. I think there's a lot of resources out there that actually can talk through human-centered design approaches, and would actually help you run that within your organization or within the community that you work with, to actually bring people together to just put them in a space where they can be creative and they can come up with, with solutions. And often those solutions can come from the communities you're working with and within your own organization. So I guess say that you don't need, large, online platforms that potentially do cost a lot of money to actually do this. You can, use resources to do this, simply in the field.
Thanks, Jenny. And no, that is actually quite true. And I think, judging even from our own experience here at UNHCR Innovation, we do have a tendency to put a lot of emphasis on the tool and the platform, but you're right, behind these tools and platforms, there's really a real human process and a real human element. And it is possible to go into your local communities and do participatory workshops with them where you basically source the ideas from them. Matt, you also talked about duplication of platforms, and this is something that we're seeing. Everyone now has an innovation unit, and now each one of those innovation units has a platform. And couldn't there be a way, especially back to Garden Pool's question, where if there's an NGO who wants to run a challenge, that they could simply team up with somebody who may already have a platform and work together. I have another question from Twitter. Marie wants to know how can we make sure that innovation is homegrown or accepted by those who need to benefit from it? Jenny, you're already unmuted, so why don't we start with you?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's a really good point there. I think it's important to have the beneficiaries actually being able to have a voice in the creation of the challenge in the first place. So this is going back to the point that a few people have raised here about doing that research in the first place, and actually when you're actually coming up with those challenges. So actually allowing the beneficiaries, actually allowing the communities, to have a voice in that process. I think the other thing that's really important, and this is something that I'm kind of always telling the students that participate in the EWB Challenge program, is for the people, for the innovators, the people coming up with ideas, to remember that it's not their project. Your role is to generate ideas, but it's not for you. It's for a community. It's for the beneficiaries. And in the end, it's going to be up to them, which ideas that they select and which ideas that they find most appropriate, and and up to the organisation, work with them to help facilitate that actual implementation process to make sure that it's done in an appropriate way. I think that then that comes down to the implementation end, and actually helping facilitate a participatory approach in sorting out those ideas and actually taking that through to implementation.
Thanks, Jenny. On the implementation front, and I'm really glad that everyone's talking about research, because I think that is such a critical element that I think a lot of people miss when it comes to doing these types of challenges. And Vincent, I wanted to ask if maybe you can share a little bit on just the implementation aspect. So we move through research, we move through contextual needs. When it comes to looking at how you're now going to implement and roll out a winning idea, are you doing that work at the beginning? Are you finding maybe a particular operation or particular unit or division within ICRC to work on implementing that together, to sort of avoid the push innovation concept? And are they making that commitment to implement even before you start this challenge?
Well, that's an extremely tricky question, I think, and if we had the solution, the silver bullet here, I'm sure we could, really teach other people how to do that. Yeah, what we're trying to do that. We have, the formal process of how we bring ideas to prototype and pilots, but there's also all the things that happens behind the scenes, like, by just people talking and networks and things like that. Now, when we approach the units, we are looking for, okay, first thing is, obviously, all our pilots will be tested with the help of what we call delegations on the field. We'll have commitment of the people on the ground, to provide resources to test the things. When it comes at the end of the pilot, when we do to evaluation and checking other kind of compatibility, especially when it's ICT related, we're looking for, obviously, sort of a sponsorship in one of the units that will bring it forward. Now, the thing is, again, there's not one single fit all type of answer. So you have such small things sometimes that would just live by themselves and go back to the field directly. So we'll pretty much deliver something which is about lesson learned and maybe best practices. So maybe something even which is in terms of documents or contacts for implementing. And to the other extreme, we have the very large project that may shuffle the process of an entire department division, and everything in between, where it's more tricky. So I'm afraid we don't have an all made up ready answer for that, but definitely we're trying to have, that's one way of looking at sustainability. That's the one for us to support the things. You have many other areas for sustainability, but this one, and that's what we're looking for, definitely.
Thanks, Vincent. So you touched on sustainability, and I really want to get back to that later, but we did have a question come in on Twitter from Tasha. It's a bit of an interesting question, but she wants to know, what's the most innovative thing you've seen in a developing country created with the fewest resources? I think everyone's going to need to think a little bit about that one. We can cue the Jeopardy game show theme. Can anyone think of one?
Yeah. I've got one that was actually, it hasn't, I don't think it's been piloted yet, but it was actually thought of by a group of women at the University of Melbourne who were participating in the Interview Challenge program. And it's actually for a challenge that based in Nepal around women's menstruation. In Nepal, women are often, I guess, menstruation is quite taboo, and so women are often ostracized from the community when they're menstruating. So sometimes, for example, they're not allowed to sleep in the same house as the rest of their family. Sometimes they're not allowed to cook. Sometimes they're not allowed to go to temple. Sometimes they're not allowed to go to school. And so, as you can imagine, this is quite inconvenient for women. And so often they're actually trying to hide the fact that they're menstruating. Women use reusable cloths there, and these need to be washed and dried before they can be used again. But because the women are actually trying to hide that, they're often drying these cloths, in dark corners of the house or under mattresses, where the conditions are actually not that hygienic. And this is actually causing a lot of health problems within the community. And one of the ways to tackle this is through education and education about women's health issues, and normalizing that within the community. But those education kind of programs actually take a long time. So the girls at the University of Melbourne came up with a device called the Tom Box for women to use in the meantime. And effectively what it is it's a very, very simple box that you can make out of bamboo or anything. So it's just a frame. And around that frame you wrap like a hessian sack. And inside the box are a series of rails that you could hang your cloths on. So you would never know if there were cloths in the box or not because the hessian sack is keeping it private. And what the box was designed to do was actually to sit in between a gap in between the wall and a roof, which is quite typical in houses in Nepal for natural ventilation. And so you can actually hoist this box up to sit in that gap. And so you could use that natural ventilation system to actually dry the cloths in a really hygienic manner. And this is really quite clever because it actually allows the women to keep things private. People can't see it and can't see whether there's anything in the box, but at the same time actually be able to dry the cloths really, really conveniently and hygienically. So I think that this was an incredible idea that came out of the Interview Challenge. And as an open innovation platform, and we're really, really excited to work with a partner organisation, Nepal Water for Health, on that later in the year to actually set up some pilots and see if communities will actually use this and think that it's a good idea.
That is a fantastic example, Jenny. So unfortunately, we're running out of time, and there are two more questions that I want to ask, and I want to talk about the sustainability bit. I know through each of our experiences, we've all talked about the fact that there's this incredibly long cycle when you move from actually launching the challenge, the ideation process, to actually being able to roll something out on the field. So my question to the panel is, how do we begin to even ensure sustainability and the longevity of our open innovation programs in a way that we really create very meaningful engagement and long-lasting change when you have such a long cycle? How do you really keep the crowd engaged so that they see that these are real results that might be coming out of this, and that it's not just some flashy marketing activity?
I think I can, I certainly don't have the answer to that very big problem, but I can have a stab at talking about some of the thoughts that we've had on the Amplify program about this. And it addresses a few of the points that have been raised in the discussion previously. I think part of the cracking this is that implementation issue that we talked about. With Amplify, we've learned very quickly from our initial kind of mistakes that a key criteria for a sort of an idea that we should support coming out of a challenge, is that the proposer is kind of rooted in the context in which the problem they're addressing is, and that they have the capacity to implement and to take forward that idea. And I think in that way we've realised that for Amplify, we're actually in a way more interested in the open side than the innovation side. The innovation is kind of the process, but the openness is the key, because it's about getting people involved and enabling DFID to work directly with and support people who we perhaps wouldn't otherwise work directly with, or maybe we would, but there would be a lot of layers in between us and them. So it's a way of enabling that it's a kind of community organisation or an organisation coming out of the community that we're supporting to take an idea forward. Or perhaps it's an organisation like that who we have enabled to collaborate with people with a certain perspective or expertise that they would not otherwise have been able to connect with. So you're facilitating those connections, and you're facilitating that direct support, and you're having a much more open process than you otherwise would. And in that way, you are, hopefully giving the kind of direct support to community organisations that you wouldn't otherwise be doing. And that human element that people have touched on is really important to go with your online process, right? So something that we have had with Amplify that we just started to try after other things we tried failed spectacularly, is to have people within specific countries who coordinate meetups, so coordinate maybe community groups who have inconsistent access to the internet. They can act as a sort of ambassador, and they can help run workshops along with the online process. So having ensuring that you are supporting, that you are leaning on the open side of your Open Innovation Challenge, that you are bringing in really new actors who really are rooted in the community that you wouldn't otherwise work with, I think gives you some reassurance that what the idea you're supporting is going to be more sustainable. I think also it's important anytime you launch an open innovation program or process is to keep asking the now what question. So if we're funding some early stage projects and some new ideas, what happens in a year to that idea, to that project? Something we're trying with Amplify is to make sure that every challenge has a kind of partner who's working long term in that space, who might be able to provide follow-on funding or take that idea forward or mentor those projects to become sort of self-sustaining enterprises. But we don't have the answer to the now what question, but I do know that it's something that you have to keep asking and not get too distracted by this really, really original and interesting process where you're kickstarting all this new stuff. What's going to happen in a couple of years is always the important thing to be asking yourself.
Thanks, Olivia. Does anyone else have a response to that? Okay, so I'm going to move on to our final question, and this one is actually from Twitter. And Nina wants to know for each of you, how do you define success within an innovation challenge? So what does success look like? At what point do you say this was a successful innovation challenge? Can it even be defined? So Nora, I'll start with you.
Sure, that's a great question. Difficult one to end on. And I guess I would say from our experience, being able to define success starts with having some clarity on what the objective of the challenge is, right? And I think for us that's been one of the biggest lessons learned, is how important it is to know going into a challenge what your objective for that is, and that enables you to sort of assess the success. So as I said, for us, the objective with a lot of these challenges is about building a community of practice and practitioners around our innovation principles, around user-centered design, more so than it is about the particular outputs of that competition. So for us, success in that is seeing, young going on to start their own companies locally in the countries where the challenge has happened. So we see success when the challenge is feeding into a bigger system, again, of sustainability, where there's local economic development, young people are driving solutions in communities. So for us, that's a measure of success. And I think, there's other ways to look at success too, which is, has an actual product come out of this that is being used by UNICEF for what we're doing. And to me, that has the same failure rate as a startup, right? So it's going to fail like 90% of the time. So, I think for us, the real big measure of success is engagement and seeing how the people who participate in these challenges go on to apply the processes and the ideas that they've learned in other parts of their work. And we often see that they come back to us. They apply for jobs with UNICEF, or they go on to start similar things in their community. And I think that's the kind of system that we really want to be growing. So thank you.
Anyone else on our panel wants to share how they would define success with an innovation challenge? Vincent?
Yeah, real quickly, I would really agree with what Nora just said. I think for the challenge itself, if you can really see there's a momentum and the community working on it, real collaboration and exchanges about, I'm coming up with an idea, another solution. That was also very, very interesting what you said earlier, Nora. We're not having solution for looking for problems. The same way we're not looking for, on our platform, we don't want it to become like a tender marketplace where everybody comes with ready, off-the-shelf kind of solution and saying, hey, mine is cheaper, or this kind of things. So really the challenge should be around, did we see something happening and people from diverse horizons and diverse profiles, did they share ideas, did they collaborate, did something happen that we can even potentially take offline? So we're not sure it's going to be the solution to be implemented, but that would be a success as well, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. Anyone else? Okay, so this has been really, really enjoyable for me, and I've been watching the clock every now and then because there's so many more questions, so it's possible that I might be calling you guys for a part 2 to this conversation. But I just did want to say again, thank you so much for taking the time to join this really important conversation on open innovation challenges, and thanks to our partner +SocialGood, and thanks to everyone for watching. We'll soon be posting the recording today, and I can see that a lot of people have a lot of questions about this, so please feel free to reach out to us, send a tweet, send an email to innovation@unhcr.org. And thank you again for joining us, and we will see you in August for more Innovating for Good.